That's how you know the recording's in progress.
Helpful.
Good evening, and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Katie from Greenlight, and we're excited to welcome you to our online event series, Squawkin Sports, hosted by Patrick Sauer and David J. Roth. For this installment, they'll be chatting with Britni and Lyndsey D'Arcangelo about their new book, Hail Mary, The Rise and Fall of the National Women's Football League. So you're in for an excellent time. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to our hosts, Patrick and David, and tonight's featured authors, Britni and Lyndsey, for making this happen, and to all of you for showing up. Though we're not able to host events in our store spaces, our community of authors and readers is still here. We're grateful for your support and for the chance to make space for conversation and connection. There's just a few housekeeping things to go over before we get started tonight. In our Zoom webinar, you can see and hear the speakers, but they can't see or hear you. They can see that you're here though, and you can see a count of fellow attendees on the top of your Zoom screen. There are a couple of different ways that you can interact with the authors and with each other throughout tonight's event, which we highly encourage. The first is the chat, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like one speech balloon. You're welcome to post your comments and thoughts in the chat. It's a great way to show your appreciation for the authors and to interact with fellow attendees. So if you have a specific question you'd like to have answered by the authors, please post that in the Q&A module, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like two speech balloons. We'll be pulling questions only from the Q&A to be answered in the later part of the program, so please make sure you're putting your questions there and not in the chat. And importantly, tonight's featured book, Hail Mary, is available for sale from Greenlight Bookstore. We're excited to be able to offer actual shopping in our bookstore locations, 12 p.m. to 7 p.m. every day of the week. And you can purchase Britni and Lyndsey's book and many others on site. Or you can order online at greenlightbookstore.com for a quick pickup at the store or for shipping anywhere in the US. If you care about supporting the careers of authors and the ongoing existence of independent bookstores, buying tonight's featured book is a great way to show your support. Your series hosts for Squawkin Sports are Patrick Sauer and David J. Roth. Patrick has written for many large publications you've heard of and even more small ones that no longer exist. He's a founding member of the Billings, Montana to Brooklyn sports writing pipeline. David was an editor at Deadspin and is now a co-founder and co-owner at Defector.com. His writing has appeared in The New Republic, The New Yorker, Food and Wine, and The Baffler. We'll be speaking with featured authors Britni and Lyndsey D'Arcangelo. Britni is a freelance writer who focuses on the intersection of sports and gender. They're the former sports columnist for Long Reads and for Bitch Media. Their work has appeared in the New York Times, Rolling Stone, ESPNW, Vogue, The Washington Post, Teen Vogue, and The Ringer, The Bleacher Report, The Atlantic, and more. They live in the Boston area. Lyndsey D'Arcangelo writes about women's college basketball and the WNBA for The Athletic. Her articles, columns, and profiles on female/LGBTQ+ athletes have previously appeared in The Ringer, Deadspin, ESPNW/ESPN, Teen Vogue, and more. She received a notable mention in the 2018 Best American Sports Writing Anthology for her story, My Father, Trump, and the Buffalo Bills. Lyndsey lives in Buffalo, New York. Their new book, Hail Mary, is the story of the unlikely rise of the National Women's Football League and the players who loved a game that society told them they shouldn't be playing. Against the backdrop of second-wave feminism and the passage of Title IX, these athletes broke new barriers and showed adoring crowds that what women were capable of physically. Hail Mary brings us into the stadiums where they broke records, the small-town lesbian bars where they were recruited, and the back rooms where the league was conceived and where it ended. Britni will be starting us off with a reading from the book, and then Britni and Lyndsey will be talking with Patrick and David and with all of you. Please take it away, Patrick, David, Britni, and Lyndsey.
Thank you.
Right.
All right. I will start reading. We're going to read about a fight. I'm very excited. Even though the league was only 1 year old in 1975, there were rivalries galore in the NWFL. But perhaps the most brutal rivalry was between the Toledo Troopers and the Detroit Demons. One paper described the teams as football's answer to the Hatfields and McCoys, calling their matchups something between a grudge battle and a holy war. The teams knew each other well. Due to relative proximity, they played each other often. They'd had years for animosity to build into full-blown hatred. At least one game ended in the third quarter when the Demons felt the Troopers were headhunting and officiating was favoring the Troopers, so they opted to just go home instead of continue playing. To hear the Troopers tell it, however, Detroit went home because they were being beaten so badly. It was even rumored that they taunted each other with dog biscuits prior to games, and that the Detroit team had a dummy with Linda Jefferson's number on it that they would pulverize during practice. They hated us because we were good at what we did, said Trooper Gloria Jimenez. The Troopers considered unsportsmanlike actions, like the digs they faced from teams like Detroit and Dallas, to be the behavior teams of lesser ability would resort to in retaliation. The notorious fight happened on October 25th, 1975, during a Saturday night game in Detroit. The Demons were not very good at football, but they played dirty and had bad attitudes, which took them further than their lack of skill might have otherwise. The Troopers arrived in Detroit and exited the little yellow school bus that had transported them to the game, which doubled as their locker room because there was no locker room for the opposing team in Detroit, to a cold and rainy Michigan evening. They were already in a bad mood, having had an uncomfortable ride-up, no changing facilities, and dismal weather. There was tension in the air before the game even started, and that, coupled with the fact that anytime the two teams met, it was ugly and there was usually controversy, according to Jimenez, meant the entire thing was a powder keg waiting to explode. During the team's first 6 meetings, 2 games per season in 1972, 73, and 74, the Demons failed to score a single point against the Troopers. Toledo, for their part, scored 225 points in those 6 games. Losing to the same team over and over again gets incredibly frustrating, although so does beating the same teams over and over again. Jefferson told Women's Sports Magazine that winning all the time without a challenge was getting old. Running over the competition every time they took the field may have been fun at first, but by 1975, the Troopers were ready for a challenge, and that October evening, Detroit was ready to give it to them. One of the meetings between the two teams the previous month had been the closest the Demons had ever come to beating the mighty Troopers. The final score was 20-18. What had changed was that for the first time in their existence as a team, the Demons had a coach who was invested in teaching them the ins and outs of the game. The team that had started as a gimmick under Sid Friedman may have wrested control away from the promoter out of a desire to play real football, but they lacked anyone to teach them how. That October night, Detroit managed to get on the board, but Toledo was dominant again. The frustration of having been so close the last time and failing to pull out a victory this time likely pushed the Demons over the edge. At the end of the fourth quarter, the Troopers kicked off with just enough time for one more play. Jimenez punted the ball. The way Demons coach Tom Brown recalled it, the punt was blocked and a fight broke out. Jimenez remembers the team running down the field, and Jimenez and fellow trooper Verna Henderson zoned in on the Demons player with the ball. Out of nowhere, Sunday Jones, 6'1", one of Toledo's hardest hitters, known to her teammates as Dr. Death, clocked the girl with the ball, knocking her right into Detroit's sideline. The Demons snatched off her helmet and hit Jones with it. Several Demons rushed the field. Within moments, both benches had cleared and players were wielding their helmets like weapons, swinging them willy-nilly at whoever was in their path. It was no little thing, Troopers PR person Ken Dittman told the Toledo Blade. Troopers blocking back, 4'11", 90-pound Dorothy Parma sat on the chest of a Demons player who weighed twice as much as she did. Every time the Detroit player would try to get up, Parma would hit her in the face. Jimenez remembers swinging her helmet at Demons coaches because that's who was closest to her at the time. The fight effectively ended the game. The two teams met the next week in Toledo, where the papers promoted the game by regaling readers with tales of the fight the weekend before. In doing so, the papers neglected to mention a single play or even the final score. It was 19-7. The Troopers' Dittman had to insist that the fight had not been staged for promotional purposes. After all, the teams had parted ways with Sid Friedman because they didn't want to be a spectacle, but the papers were insistent on continuing to make them one. Toledo coach Bill Stout was known for taking film of every game and making his team watch it obsessively. Every Monday night, the players gathered in Stout's basement to review film and recap the previous game. It was part of what made the Troopers so good. It was also what made it impossible for any player to deny her involvement in the melee with Detroit. We come to the part about the fight, and everyone's going, well, I didn't do nothing, remembers Jimenez. Of course, here he's got us on film, and he's got me on film. I'm swinging at the coaches. Toledo won those games against Detroit, but their victories were getting harder to pull off, and other teams were becoming more competitive. They failed to shut out Detroit in any of their 4 meetings in 1975 and didn't score more than 25 points in a single game, a far cry from the thrashings they'd given the Demons earlier in their career. An injury to quarterback Lee Howler's hand also hurt the team because with Howler injured, other teams knew the Troopers' passing game would be hobbled. It became easy for opponents to guess what the Troopers were going to do. They were going to run the ball, and the person running it was going to be Jefferson. Jefferson was quick, and her offensive line was good, but the question remained, how long would it be before a team figured out how to shut her down?
Very nice. Welcome, everybody. Here's the cover. Here's what it looks like. Nice
I also have one.
Catholic cover. I want to start by saying, so one thing this book did, which was totally unexpected, I played high school football. The 2 years I was on varsity, we were 1-15, including a glorious 0-8 senior year campaign. Starting in 100-degree 2-a-days and ending in 2 feet of Montana snow. Crappy uniforms, school buses, the whole nine. This book reminded me how much fun all that was. Even though it's always kind of terrible, it's great. And this book is fantastic at getting at why, not just why women would want to play football, anyone would want to play football and get dirty and knock people's and wear, ill-fitting shoulder pads and helmets. And so I guess, where did you start from the football side of it? Was it, first of all, how did you find this league? Because I'd never heard of any of it. And I remember being a kid, I remember the World Football League with Larry Zonka was on the cover of Sports Illustrated. So had this been around even remotely publicly, I think I would have some reference to it, but I hadn't heard of none of it. So how'd you guys find it? How'd you find the people, and how much fun was the football stories straight up?
I'll tell you how we found it. Lyndsey can talk about the football. We found this league while we were researching a different book about women's football that didn't ultimately sell. It was a much more generalized history of women in football kind of book. I had been looking to read about women in football because I didn't know a lot about it and was writing some stuff and thought it would be helpful. And the book I was looking for just didn't exist. But I don't know a lot about football. It's not one of the sports I cover. And so I, if I was going to write a book, I was going to do it with Lyndsey. And so while we were researching just kind of the history of women's football, we discovered the Troopers, which for people who don't know, they're the winningest team in pro football history, men's or women's, to this day. And what little is out there publicly about the league is usually about that team. And so I was writing for Long Reads at the time and decided to try to find out what happened when they lost their first game in their 6th season and recreated that loss. And it was during that piece that I was like, oh my God, there were other teams, but there's nothing about them. And who are they playing? And like, what was this? There's so much here and the women are still alive. And so it really felt like this had to be the book.
Yeah, as far as the football aspect, I'm a big football fan. Grew up playing it with my brothers. Played in a co-ed league as an adult. Just have been a Buffalo Bills fan my entire life. But writing about the football aspect in the book was fun. I mean, seeing these women learn plays and actually execute them on the field and talk in the football colloquial terms and really grasp the whole concept of not just playing for fun, but really they took it very seriously, and as anyone would in a league, and it's fun. For this book, it has so much for everyone, not just football fans. There's a lot to this book that I think people from different walks of life can get something out of, but the football aspect is definitely comes across the page, and we definitely cover a lot of games.
Lyndsey had to read my gameplay descriptions to make sure that I was saying things correctly and it made sense.
That fits with it fits with the book. So many of the women are just like, well, I'll join up because it's something to do, get out of the house. Like there was a lot of people who were just like, okay, why not?
Mm-hmm.
There's something really like loose and fun about like the general like vibe of it. I mean, as serious as the play was, there's like this layer of kind of like good-natured 70s scuzz on top of all of it that is just like, it's a delight to read. You can get a little bit of that in the excerpt that Britni read, but it's like the sports stuff is great. The broader perspective of fitting this into a history is like as good as you would expect if you've read Lyndsey and Britni's stuff. But there's the broader like context of it was fascinating to me and never anything but like startling and delightful. I guess for me, like the question is, how does something like this disappear? Like, even though it was never that big, like this was a league for going on 15 years. And it was like, it had stars, you know, like you talk about, like Linda Jefferson still gets recognized at the supermarket. Like these were people that had an impact in their community. And then it was just gone. Like, what happened? I mean, you kind of fit it in the context of the broader spiraling down of the 70s and 80s in the country, but like, where did it go? Like, I guess.
I would add to that also, it didn't really have a top down. Initially, you know, it had guys with money sort of funding the teams, but it didn't fall apart in the way leagues usually fall apart, which is
it wasn't because like Donald Trump had a
right.
feud
It
with
wasn't
somebody.
like somebody just screwed it all up. They just sort of, one team would become another team and they just keep rolling. So,
well, it's all about who records the history, right? And where that's kept. And, you know, the league itself did not keep good records. We had a really difficult time finding stats. A lot of our research came from newspaper clippings. And in the beginning part of the league, there was a lot of them. There were gamers and some features here and there, a lot of satirical articles and stuff poking at the women, you know, during that time period is to be expected. And it was, I mean, you'll read about it, just how horrendous some of the media coverage was. But as the league, you know, went on, the media coverage was less and less. You know, the gamers all but disappeared. And by the time you get into the later years and into the 80s, you know, there's hardly anything at all. And a lot of the information, the history was kept by the players themselves. We got a lot of information from this book from the players who kept memorabilia, whether it was player programs or just team stats, newspaper clippings, photographs, you know, a lot of that they kept themselves in order to record this history. So Britni has a great line in the book about, you know, if a league, something along the lines of, Britni can correct me, but if does it exist at all? Like, did it ever happen if it's never recorded? So that's something Britni can add to.
Well, I was going to say, I felt that. So I had the privilege of attending the 40-year reunion of the Houston Hurricanes, which you read about in this book.
that's H-E-R-R.
The Hurricanes.
Hurricanes, yes.
And most of these women have not seen each other in 40 years. They came together because one of the players' daughters is making a documentary about the team. It's called Brick House. It's going to be great. And Lyndsey and I were invited to participate in that documentary. And so I flew down there, and these women, it's almost like, because there's no memory of this, right? Like, none of the Wikipedia pages for the stadiums they played in list the teams. The NWFL just got a Wikipedia page today because of our book.
Ask you about
Somebody created it today because of the
Getting
book.
Results, which is good.
But like, for so many of the players, it's almost like nobody remembers us. Nobody has asked about us. We've been waiting 40 years for someone to like ask about the fact that we did it. And it's like, was it a dream? Did I really play professional football in the 70s? And then they're all in the room and they're, you know, sharing memories. And it's like, oh yeah, we did that. That actually was real. But it can, you know, no one remembers. It's sort of, you start to like question your own reality a little bit.
There's a lot of things I want to ask you, but I do want to do one straight up writerly question. How do you co-write a book, and how do you co-research a book, which I would think would be even harder? How do you divide that up?
Very carefully. No, actually, Britni and we found out when we wrote our first book proposal, so that the league, this league was our second book proposal. The first one was a wider look at women in football altogether. Just from the history up until now, and, you know, looking at how women have become coaches, refs, analysts, like, and have immersed themselves in the game. So the first book proposal we wrote, we realized we worked well together, and just sort of our styles just sort of fit. And so with the book project, it was more like, okay, let's take how we approach that and just, you know, widen that lens a little bit. And with the research, I mean, there's so much here. We kind of just decided we found out about some teams, split those teams, and then I went and researched that, and Britni went and researched that, and I also looked into the history a lot, while Britni did a lot of the analytical stuff, looking at why football is so popular in the Rust Belt, the feminist aspect. So we really just sort of, play to our strengths. And Britni can tell you more about our different processes.
Well, I was going to say there's some chapters that were written in, like I wrote all of part 1, Lyndsey wrote all of part 2. And then there's some stuff that's hybrid, right? Where like a tidbit from my stuff would fit in and I just kind of plop a paragraph in or whatever and worked really well. But I will say, like, first of all, our styles mesh really well because Lyndsey has a fiction background. And so a lot of the like really beautiful character work in this book comes from Lyndsey. I will get bogged down in the like analysis to the point that nobody cares but me. And so Lyndsey was really good at like pulling me back from some of that. But I'm also like a sprinter in that and procrastinator. Sprinter is what I call procrastination because like Lyndsey's never missed a writing deadline in her whole career. And I believe deadlines are suggested starting dates for projects. So Lyndsey wrote diligently every day. And I wrote like probably half of my section of the book in like a week and a half right before it was due.
Did that terrify you, Lyndsey? Or you knew what to expect?
No, I mean, of course I would get nervous and I gently poke Britni and be like, hey, I'm just checking in, see how things are going. But no, I mean, if you look at Britni's work, I knew it would get done. And I knew that Britni had a different approach than I did and works much better when it's go time and got to get it in under the wire. And like, I remember that last part when Britni was writing those last however many words that you had to get in there. And I would go into the doc and look and I just see Britni typing away. And just, you see it. I'm like, I said to my wife, I'm like, Britni just wrote like 10,000 words in a day. Like it was crazy. But yeah, I mean, of course, I got a little nervous to answer your initial question, but I always knew that it would get done.
I think we respect each other so much as writers that we just trusted that it would happen.
Mm-hmm.
And who drove the big slaying your babies, as it were? Did you both have to take hits, or did you leave it up to the editor, or was there not anything that was like one of you was desperate to keep this in and the other one's like, I don't care about this?
Not a lot on the cutting room floor for this one.
That's nice.
If anything, we had to add, maybe go a little deeper in some sections.
I think that from the beginning of the project, because it has the capacity to be such a large project, because there's 19 teams and thousands of women, from the beginning, we sort of knew it wasn't going to be comprehensive. And we had a container around our research. And we sort of knew that there was going to be a stopping point when we were going to have to call it and be like, this is what it is. And so having that container, I think, helped us know where the story ended a little bit.
Can you lay out real quick, just for people who are watching, just the scope of the league, the basic years, and the two teams that sort of dominated at least the first half?
Yeah, sure. The league existed from 1974 to roughly 1988. That is when we think the last game played under the NWFL umbrella existed or happened. We say that its heyday is about 74 to 79 or 80, which is when, at one point there was 14 teams and 3 divisions at its height. And that is also the time period when I think the 2 teams that you are referring to are the Toledo Troopers, who I've already mentioned. They are the winningest team of all time. Their record is disputed because, again, stats are hard to come by, but somewhere around 64-5 in 9 seasons. And the Oklahoma City Dolls, who were the team that handed the Troopers their first loss in their first game of the 6th season. And they played for about 4 years and were also incredibly good. They had one season where they only allowed 8 points from their opponents.
And my wife is from Tulsa, so I'm desperately finding a Tulsa Babes, anything.
If we come across it, we'll let you know.
Yeah,
I'm sure she'd be thrilled.
Is there any like ephemera out there? I'm assuming you were too busy writing a book, but do you ever like catch a t-shirt on eBay or something like that? Is it there?
You can buy Trooper shirts. There's
Nice.
a Toledo-based company that makes them. Yeah.
Did so when you were reaching out to the women, were they, I mean, I'm sure most wanted to talk about it. How many were the people just surprised to hear about it? Had they thought about it in a long time? Because it's one of those things where it's been long enough that it's kind of like, oh, I did this crazy thing as a kid, and tell your grandkids. But it must have been like, wait, you're writing a book about this? I didn't know we were book worthy. Was that kind of the response you got from a lot of them?
Yeah, I think it varied. I had two players on one team, one who was kind of like, you know what, it's just something I did. I don't really think much about it. I'm talking about Joyce, Britni. But at the same time, Joyce kept a ton of memorabilia, like pictures and article clippings and just a ton of stuff. A lot of the pictures that we got came from her. Yes, that's Joyce, which I find hilarious because Joyce not only played, she also got hurt and then couldn't play anymore, but stayed with the team as like the unofficial trainer with the LA Dandelions for another year or so before she stopped, before she went on with her teaching career. But yeah, it's kind of funny. And then you have other players who were like, this was the best time of my life. I'll always remember it. And who were so just, had these vivid memories and visuals and just were so happy to talk about it.
Did you have trouble finding anybody? I mean, were they just basic research, or did you talk to Linda Jefferson? I didn't.
I did. I got her once. It took me 2 years. I got a phone call from an unknown number and it said, "Hi, this is Linda Jefferson. I hear you've been looking for me." I had her for 2 hours and she never answered another follow-up phone call again. But I got her.
She's the Barry Sanders of both the league and the
Yeah.
We couldn't write about this book without talking to Linda, and we knew she was around. She was participating. There's a Troopers documentary that just finished, and there's a book about the team coming out next year, and we knew she was active and all of that. And her teammates are like giving me her phone number, and then it's the wrong number. I mean, it was like a whole, but yeah, I thought it would be easier than it was, but we did find her.
Yeah, of all the challenges in writing about a league, when its most famous participant disappears while just kind of hanging out and continuing to live a normal person's life, not a problem that you would get writing about most sports leagues, I would imagine. Go ahead.
I was just gonna add, it was definitely hard getting in touch with some players, as Britni just explained, but and then others were more than willing and would pass along your info to another teammate and would kind of go down the line. But there were some that we wanted to talk to that we didn't get to talk to for whatever reason, just not being able to get in touch, or it just, and we're hoping that from this book more players will come forward, because we obviously didn't talk to everyone and weren't able to, so we're just hoping other people will come and say, hey, I played too, and have a story to share as well.
So there's something that I always get real global with this. I want to ask all the writer questions too, but I can just do that when there's people that, when there are only writers in the room, I will ask you about it. But in this case, one of the tensions in the book that I find the most kind of fascinating, and I guess it's hard not to use corny words, but kind of inspiring, I guess, in this, is that it was not an entirely cynical, the league itself was not an entirely cynical conception, but it came and was backed initially by a guy who was just an unbelievable huckster, even by the standards of early Nixon era huckster types. He's a theatrical promoter from Cleveland who had at one point had the idea of an Miss Outer Space beauty pageant. He represented Jimmy Pearsall when he was a wrestling referee. This is not a guy that should be giving any sort of significant enterprise life. And yet the tension between how sort of unseriously a lot of the people that wrote about the league or were even sort of behind it, not to say that Sid Freeman wasn't serious about it, but that the players added all this gravity and dignity to the experience of playing in the league, even though everything around it seemed not to take it seriously. And I guess in some ways that is a lesson in the book and stuff like that. But to what extent were the players aware, I guess, what was it like to play in the league, and how did they feel about the way that they were being sort of covered, managed, whatever? Like, how did that land as like a worker in that workplace?
Well, just a quick stipulation. Sid didn't back the NWFL. It was started separate from him.
Okay, all right.
He had his own group of teams, which was the impetus for the NWFL, because other people saw what he was doing and decided to form their own teams. And then eventually the league started separate from him. But yeah, I think there were a couple of teams, the Detroit Demons and the Troopers, who were in his group of teams initially before coming over to the NWFL, because they didn't like the way he treated them and saw them more as a means to an end rather than someone who really believed in women's football and wanted to grow the sport. The president of the NWFL, Robert Matthews, who also owned the LA Dandelions, was the guy who really believed in the future of the sport and wanted to see it come to fruition. Yeah, but Britni can add to the players as far as leaving Friedman and starting, their own, wanting to play and wanting to create their own destiny and do that separately of like you said, this huckster.
I mean, 3 of the 7 original NWFL teams started under Friedman, and they left. The Troopers left because Sid Friedman was frustrated that they were beating his team so badly, and he wanted the Troopers to throw games, and they were like, absolutely not. The Columbus Pacesetters and the Detroit Demons both had hustler photographers sent to their practices by Sid Friedman, and they were horrified by this. I think the story of the NWFL and of like women's football generally, if you look at the history though, is men starting teams or leagues or setting up games, and it's supposed to be a joke and a gimmick, and let's all laugh at these women playing this men's sport. And the women take themselves incredibly seriously and self-determine kind of this outcome and make it real for themselves. And the NWFL is absolutely a result of these players demanding to be taken as seriously as they saw themselves.
And it's also, the longer I live, since I was old enough to go through it and have enough memories, the 70s just fascinate me more and more as a cultural decade, because when I was a kid, it was like, oh, everything's kind of rotten now. But the longer I live, is like, it seemed more that people just kind of accepted a regular life. I don't know if this league works if it starts in the 80s or the 90s. There's no bureaucracy to really stamp on it. We have to get the corporate dollars. It's mostly just women who liked playing football and liked hanging out with other women before and after the game, which just feels like, Dave said 70s scuzz. It reminds me a little of Loose Balls, which is my favorite sports book ever written about the ABA. And there's just something perfectly timed with those women wanting to do that at a time when it wasn't the 50s, you could go play football. I mean, media is going to do what they're going to do, but it wasn't unheard of. But it also didn't have, we need to have, everyone has to wear Nikes or whatever the thing is, we have to get on cable. It was just, we just need a field kind of, and we're good. Mm-hmm. And maybe we'll have to invent something to cover our breasts, because we cannot, that is an ongoing problem that they cannot solve with actual equipment.
That's another thread through the book, is like Cronenbergian body horror about, which is unavoidable if you're writing a football book.
But is the 70s as important to this league and story as any other character, if you take the decade as a character?
Totally. Like all the social movements that are kind of colliding in this decade, but then also in the 80s, you've got like we're entering the Reagan era and social conservatism, and they're already breaking norms in the 70s, but it becomes real unacceptable to break those gender norms in the 80s. And women's football itself went into I think we call it like a deep freeze from 88 when this league folds. You don't see another pro team or pro league pop up until 1999. So there is this, and now, that has been ongoing since then. We have several women's semi-pro teams or leagues around the country that have
The
been
New
playing
York Sharks, is
consistently.
that the name of the women's team? Is it the New York Sharks, or at one point was there?
Maybe there's a lot of teams. Like the Women's Football Alliance has, I think, a team in most major cities, which a lot of people don't know. But but just to, say, like, yes, the 80s and the 90s, this league could not have happened. And in fact, pretty much no women's football was happening. One thing I do hope, I found there's so little about the 80s in this, even though they were playing for 8 years. One thing I hope to learn more about as this book is published is people who played in the 80s and the NWFL will come forward and tell us more about what that was like, because it was so hard to find anything about that.
I also think the timing of the league happened right around Title IX. Like Title IX happened in 1972, and then, that was a big player in this, because women were finally allowed to participate in active sports in different institutions. And you had a lot of women who went through high school without playing anything. Rose Lowe of the Dandelions told me, we'd run a mile in gym class. Well, the guys would run, we'd have to walk it. You think about basketball around this time, the NBA was in full swing. Women were not even allowed to play full court up until a certain point in this era. So yeah, I mean, Title IX kind of like swung a door open, and then you have a ton of women who just barged right through and were able to participate in different sports in college. And then once they saw that there was an opportunity to play football, yeah, of course, where can I sign up? But also the owners and the league heads itself had no foresight, like as far as, like you said, trying to woo sponsors or figure out maybe some TV deals, or just, really creative ways to grow the league and the fan base. Their idea was just to make money off of the ticket sales that they sold at the games. That's all they were focused on, really. There was no other market and promotion, and they were just banking on the fan base growing that way, which we all know that's not how you grow a sports league. There's other factors that come into play that they just, like I said, didn't have the foresight to do.
I want to ask about a couple of players specifically, because they're such vivid characters. So let's start with, we were tweeting about this. I said she was the breakout star of the book, Starkey, who just, when I read about her, I'm like, I pictured her, and then I'm like, yep, that is exactly who I thought she'd be. And she just seems like a perfect exemplar of a woman who just wanted to knock some heads around and play some football.
Starkey is great. She's probably one of the biggest personalities in the book. She played for the Dallas Bluebonnets. She also was just super open about what her life was like at that time. She's now 30 years sober. And I'm also in recovery, so that was something that we talked a lot about. And a lot of that's not in the book, but she speaks very candidly about kind of what a mess she was at this time period. And she, showed up to the local lesbian bar to meet up with her friends one night, and someone had an ad for this football team, and they all played softball, in a league that was organized out through the bars. And they all went and showed up. She's like, I don't read the paper. I wouldn't have known. She was very much like, what's Stonewall? I didn't care about that. I was looking to make out with some hot chick. Like, that's what I was in the bar for, right? Like, this was her. And she very much was like, I played football because I wanted to smash into people. She was dating someone on the team at the time, and she says they used to work it out by putting on their pads and helmets and going out into the front yard and working it out that way. And you get such a sense of who she is from these anecdotes, and I loved her for that. And she quit because she felt like the owners were trying to make them too respectable. She was like, they started talking about wanting us to wear dresses when we traveled, and absolutely not doing that. Bye. She was a mechanic.
And it's a central part of the book. I think you said on Twitter that gay stuff is the best stuff. And, it sounded like more than tolerance in a league that was probably I think one woman said that she guessed it was 50-50 straight and gay, whatever it is. It sounded it was beyond tolerance into at least general acceptance amongst the players. And I'm curious what is, as two gay sports writers, what it was like to sort of be handed this story that no one's told about a very significant gay story. It's not the parades, it's not Stonewall, it's just women going forward being who they are.
I think like Linz and I were both aware that probably at least some of the players were gay, not just because like of stereotypes about women's sports, but just because like queer folks are everywhere. We like we just exist everywhere.
Yeah, the odds would be against it going any other way.
The question we had was A, are the women going to be comfortable talking about it? And B, is it connected to the story? Do they see these two things as linked in their mind, this league and, being lesbians? And the truth is that a lot of them did. The queer players, they played, like I mentioned, like a lot of softball leagues and basketball leagues and pickup games were organized out of their local bars. And they were community spaces, not just the bars, but the teams. They became, I think about how marginalized folks are really good at finding ways to create safe space in a really hostile world. And like, this is an example of doing that. I think the sheer number of queer players that were on the team probably contributed to why it was such a safe space. Because straight players are either outnumbered or there's just like so many that you just have to, you accept it. And then once you get on the field, you realize pretty quickly, like these differences do not matter. And for many of the straight players, playing in the league shaped their social politics forever, because it was their first time being able to spend much time around queer women. And they realized that it was not a big deal. And they would talk about their boyfriends, and, the queer players would talk about their girlfriends, and it just became, okay. But I do, for like us as queer sports writers, and also a lot of the work like I do specifically, I work really hard to write queer narratives back into sports, not because I think like all sports are gay, but because like I think that queer folks get erased, or like our queerness is seen as like extraneous or like irrelevant. And I think that that's just like false. And it makes it, I think Lyndsey would agree with this, that it feels really important to visibilize the history of our community and to just show that like we are built into the fabric of like our country, of our world, of the society that we live in.
Yeah, of course I agree with that. I actually got my start, my road into sports writing was writing for a national best-selling lesbian magazine and being their sports writer, writing about lesbian athletes. Mm-hmm. This is like 2010 to 2015, when it was still a big deal to come out as an athlete. And I was profiling, people like Megan Rapinoe and Britni Griner and, BMX stars. I actually profiled Sammy Grassi, who was an incredible women's football player at the time, was the best quarterback ever to play in women's football currently in the modern era. But yeah, it's of course I value that. Britni values that. And while we didn't want it to be all of the book, but we wanted it to be, especially after Britni discovered, Britni got to talk to all the gay players. I didn't. All the players on the teams that I covered, either, they were straight, or they were like, yeah, I would like to leave that part out of my narrative, which I totally respect. They grew up in a different time period, and that's how they felt. But once Britni uncovered this Dallas story, it was like, yeah, let's do it. We got to put it in there.
Yeah, I got so much 50-year-old like lesbian gossip. Some of it's in the book. You should read it. Some of it was off the record, and you will never know.
Well, it's interesting because it's such a defining thing. There was a story in the Times recently that there's only 3 lesbian bars left in all of New York City, which is, pretty astounding. And there are great reasons because of progress, but something's always lost. And you can tell you can kind of feel in this league, a lot of the players, I think, feel like something was lost and that they just didn't get a fair enough shake, even though all they really wanted to do was play football.
Yeah. I will say there were at least 5 lesbian bars in Dallas during this time, which is like incredible. And there's still like a couple that are still up. and the players still run into, that's where they see their former teammates, is like, they're like, now we're line dancing at the Roundup, which is, you know, shout out to the Roundup in Dallas, Texas. They're like, now we're line dancing there instead of playing football, but that there's still a community space for them. This is how they have stayed in touch with these women that they played football with.
That community aspect of it is a really interesting sort of thread in the book in general. But I think I keep sort of thinking about how different the world in which all of this was kind of happening was. The idea that you could get a few thousand people to come out to watch a sporting event that they didn't, like, with no proof of concept or whatever, they were just like, I don't know, that sounds interesting, whatever, I'm in Toledo, like, what else am I going to do? Like, that paradoxical, like, the openness in the culture, and then also broadly that, like, political closeness is a really sort of interesting tension in it. I don't have a question. I'm just,
yeah, well, no, 4,000 they're getting 3,000 to 4,000 fans to like some game at a high school football stadium. The Boston Renegades, who are currently the best women's football team in the country, they have won 3 championships in a row. They're my local women's football team. I go to their games, and like, there are not thousands of people there. We're lucky if there's 500 people in the stands. Like, that's a good day. And so I think when I was reading, and I'd been to some Renegades games before we started researching this book, and I'm seeing the numbers of people that they're citing as having bought tickets, and I'm like, 4,000 people. But at the same time, the Dallas Bluebonnets played in Texas Stadium. They shared a home with the Cowboys, which people do not realize. Like, they were playing in the same, and so 4,000 people, you're like, wow. And then you picture 4,000 people in Texas Stadium, and it's like 4 rows.
Yep.
That's literally every Mets game from the 1970s, basically.
I'm a Marlins fan. I think we have the lowest attendance in the modern era.
The chapter was really fantastic on the broader part, synthesizing women's lib movement, ERA movement, the nascent gay rights movement, and then a lot of women who were in, as you know, these teams were in Rust Belt, who weren't really connected to any of that. They are apolitical, but they're political just in their very being. And I thought that was it was a really well written chapter. It also, I don't know if you guys watched the Miss America series on Hulu. That's like an entire thing throughout that runs through the whole thing. Basically, should we let Black women have their say? Should we let lesbians have their say? And all of that plays out in your book. And it's a really great chapter that I think perhaps this book could have just been the fun football stuff, but that chapter and some of the other stuff really expands it into, like, this is why this is important more than simply because it existed. And did you have that in mind from the beginning? Did that come together after you started? Did it ever start as just a sports story at any point?
No, I think Britni does a great job of kind of looking at things from that lens and saying, okay, we're missing this, or we're missing the Rust Belt, like you said, like the Rust Belt. Britni kept posing that question to us about how, like, what is it about football, and why was it so, addictive in the Rust Belt area, and why did it take such a hold? And did an excellent job of posing those type of questions as we were writing. There's some stuff we knew we had to write about, or we knew we had to look into, like the feminist part, the way these players were viewed by the media, and how the media covered them, and also the racial aspect on different teams. But there were other things that were being maybe overlooked, and Britni did a great job of zeroing that down. And actually, they wrote that chapter that you're talking about.
Thanks, Lynn. I think you couldn't write this book without talking about women's lib, because the newspaper coverage would not shut up about women's lib.
Yeah, that was interesting. Yeah.
And they were insistent, like, every player was asked, are you a women's libber? Because of course no woman would want to play football unless it was some feminist statement. And in addition to, like, what does your presumed male partner think of you playing, and how does this keep you fit and in shape? These are the questions they're being asked. And then I've seen a little bit of coverage of the league, kind of looking back, that really shoehorns this idea of the women's second wave feminism and this league, and how they are intertwined. And when you talk to the players, like, they reject that narrative pretty wholeheartedly, most of them. And it felt really irresponsible to try to put that narrative onto people who rejected it. And I think kind of similarly, David, to what you were saying about you have someone like Sid Friedman, who kind of is a hustler and, you know, is exploiting the women in certain ways. And yet it's because of him that the NWFL eventually was able to take hold. I think similarly, you can look at activism and like societal change doesn't just happen like on a picket line or like in an organizing meeting. And so like I think we call them unwitting activists in the book because you don't have to identify with feminism to, you know, insist on doing something that you've been told you can't do. And so what all these women had in common was that they were breaking rules about what women could and like should do, not just in playing football, but a lot of them worked in trades. They were the only women like climbing telephone poles. They were some of the first women promoted during this time and faced like a lot of resistance. And so I think a lot about how societal change happens just because people insist on not taking no for an answer. And that's what these women did. And so it felt really important to complicate that narrative and not flatten it to just they played football during women's lib, so they were feminists.
It's when you mentioned the media thing, this is something else you sparked I'd completely forgotten about because it didn't go anywhere. But I was some sort of editor or staff writer on an NFL for Women magazine, and it was going to be given out at stadiums. And it collapsed because it was around 2008. The financial crisis kind of buried it. But even then, we were arguing for smarter stuff. Particularly one of the people, money behind it, guys behind it, was like, we need to tell them what a tight end is.
Yeah,
I'm pretty sure you don't. I'm like, we can have Elizabeth Hasselbeck's nachos recipe. That's fine, but could you explain, like, you know, the pro set, you know, offense? Like, I think people who go to football games, most of them have at least a general idea of how it works. But that was in 2008, so you know.
Yeah, I mean, it's like hack to complain about the bad sports writing that you guys quote. Although it is, as somebody who reads a lot of sports writing, it's never anything but a delight to read how incredibly bad so much of the shit that was written about this league was. But it's like, I think like Britni was saying, that it's like they just keep trying to find some way to write about this that doesn't involve football. That they're just kind of, they're not interested in the football. Like, this is all like, so that like oafish gaze of that era is like, I don't know. There's something really nice about being able to pull this story out from under the weight of those columns and that coverage. Like, it's really an impressive thing that you did it.
And even if there was good football being played, and then it was like, oh yeah, but you know what? They're actually, you know, we're not doing so bad.
Yeah, it's
like
all
that kind of
to
thing.
be sure paragraph at the end of like whatever the 800 words of being like, you wouldn't believe it. Their husbands were terrified, but they're.
Well, I think actually then let's run the clip, because so many of the women had not played before. I started watching a lot of footage in the last few days, and I thought it would be, the football level of football would be much lower just because they didn't ever play before, but it's certainly, you know, better than your average, I don't know, small college, mid college. I don't know where you want to slot it, but it would, at least the footage I saw was better than I would have thought it would be.
Varied by team.
Okay, well then we are looking at the GOAT. So this is Linda Jefferson, 1,800 yards one season on 100 carries. Derrick Henry ain't getting that.
They're playing the dolls.
That's true. Most of the footage I watched was of the Troopers, I should say that.
Yeah, that's what exists mostly out there. The Troopers themselves did a great job of you know, preserving their history. They had a lot of memorabilia and things because they just you know, the team itself took care of that, took care of the stats and the video and all of that. They did a really nice job of that.
And they were really like, Toledo was so behind them. You talk about Linda Jefferson being on the cover of Women's Sport magazine, which was Billie Jean King's magazine for folks that don't know. But what's impressive about this, so she was voted Women's Sport Athlete of the Year. She beat out Chris Everett, Olga Corbett, like major athletes, because Toledo like showed up and they were like, we have to get Linda Jefferson to win this because people need to know who she is. She was on that, like, you remember, what is it called, like Superstars or whatever?
I actually remember. I remember watching that on when it happened, or at least one version of it.
Yeah, so she was on that, as was the Dallas Bluebonnets quarterback Barbara O'Brien also competed on a season of that as well. But yeah, she beat out like major athletes to win that and be on that cover.
I want to say we became friends online because I had written a story on a jockey named Mary Bacon, who it's the old Deadsman, if you ever want to look it up. It's kind of fun. But it was over Women's Sport magazine. You wrote a great piece on Women's Sport magazine. If you like sports writing, try to get your hands on. It's an incredible magazine, like long, thick, meaty articles, just researched to the teeth. And it's sad that nothing like that could exist now. I mean, just as a physical property, but Women's Sports magazine.
Yeah, it became Women's Sports and Fitness. So if we want to talk about like the progress, it's like
the 70s and 80s right there.
Yep.
Well, right. I mean, women's sports are presumed, if you think about the way we cover women's sports or sports content for women, it's always presumed to be participatory. You want to go for a run or like things like that. Whereas men, the coverage that we gear towards men is like spectator. And so you end up with a lot of fitness coverage directed at women and then sports coverage directed at men.
I mean, my abs can attest to that. We have to go quickly, 3 minutes. Each of you tell me one little thing about the book that just delights you. Character, moment, something, because it's a really fun book, and I highly recommend it for the holiday season, even though apparently it won't get there till Valentine's Day, but whatever.
There's so many stories, but real quick, because you mentioned the Tulsa Babes earlier, I think before we got live, but I talked to the quarterback of the Tulsa Babes, Cindy Turner, and she likened them to the Bad News Bears because they never won a game, and she, as the quarterback, she was always running for her life. So shout out to Cindy Turner and the Tulsa Babes.
Wife's hometown.
My favorite part was still recreating the Troopers' first loss because of how clearly players on both teams remembered. The Dolls players and the Troopers players will tell you it was a flea flicker play that won the game in overtime. And the clarity of that and how cool it was to, like, we have a lot of stuff that's disputed in the book, and this was not one of them.
Yeah.
And it was,
which is funny because
really
it
cool.
reads that it's like a flea flicker that follows a fucking hook and ladder play, like directly, consecutively.
I did a three-way call with the two women who were responsible for executing the hook and ladder play. So I got to hear them tell me together and like remember it. And it was so much fun. It had never succeeded in practice. The one and only time they ever executed it was in overtime of that game.
I mean, I can literally think of it working twice in the entire 40 years I've been watching football.
I don't think I've ever seen it work. I just like
Boise State beat Oklahoma, remember?
Oh yes, that's right.
And the Dolphins did it against the Chargers in that famous 41 whatever Kellen Winslow gets carried off the field game.
Well, and also the Oklahoma City Dolls defeated the Troopers.
I know. I gotta find the footage.
That's actually the best remembered out of any of them now, thanks to you. So well done. I
mean, I could write the history of hook and ladders. All sports are gay, though. That's an excellent title for a podcast or a memoir. So we have to wrap up. There's another Greenlight show coming on. Once again, happy Thanksgiving. There's their book. It's great. It's fun.
I'll drag a question just at the last minute.
All right, let's see real quick. See if we can do this really fast.
How difficult was it writing this book, finding these athletes, etc., during the pandemic?
I will quickly say that we were not able to take trips to non-digitized archives because of the pandemic. And so we recognized some gaps in what we were able to find archival stuff on.
Everything was done over the phone with the players.
12/16, our last show of the year, the last Greenlight show of the year. Dr. Todd Snyder, who's the son of a West Virginia boxing trainer turned hip hop scholar, beatboxing. how hip hop changed the fight game with Dr. Todd, our first return guest. And we're going to have a hip hop luminary, fingers crossed.
Me.
So I'll tease
Nice.
that.
It's me. I'm gonna be the guy. I'm the leader.
Dave is going to rap.
Take us out. Goodbye.
Thank you guys so much for that fantastic discussion, and thanks to everybody for joining us. Don't forget
Happy
to buy a copy of
Thanksgiving.
Hail Mary in store
Thank
online
you.
at greenlightbookstore.com. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great
Bye.
night.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, guys.